Early one morning, in early August 1886, a 39-year-old woman by the name of Mary Britland was dragged screaming for mercy from the condemned cell in Manchester's Strangeways prison to the scaffold in the purpose-built execution shed by two female wardens. The women held her on the trapdoors while James Berry, the executioner, prepared her for the ordeal. Two male wardens then took the place of the wardresses, and on a signal from Berry, they quickly stepped back, and the trapdoor was released, and Britland dropped 7 feet, dying instantaneously. She was the first woman to be executed at Strangeways. What led her to this sorry situation was that she was a callous and conniving serial killer. Mary was born in 1847 in Bolton in Lancashire, and when she was 19, in 1866, married 24-year-old Thomas Britland. By 1885, they were living in a rented house at 133 Turner Lane, Ashton-under-Lyne, near Manchester, with their 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Susanna, where they had moved to in 1885. Mary, now 38 years old, worked at 2 jobs. The first at Fisher's Mill in Turner Lane with her daughter Elizabeth by day, and as a barmaid by night. Her husband drove a cart and also worked as a barman at a pub called Heap's Vaults in Old Street. Their 18-year-old daughter Susanna was a maid in Oldham. They seemed like a normal, hard-working, happy family, and were delighted with their new home, except for the fact that it was infested with mice. In February, Mary, in order to attempt to eliminate the infestation, went to the nearby chemist and bought some packets of Harrison's vermin killer. As this contained both strychnine and arsenic, she was required to sign the poison register. Like many families at the time, the Britlands had small life insurance policies, which would cover the cost of a simple funeral for each member, in their case with the Prudential Insurance Company. At the time, for a modest funeral, it would have cost about £6. 90-year-old Elizabeth was to be the first of Mary's victims. It is thought that Elizabeth suspected that her mother was having an affair with a neighbour called Thomas Dixon. She became ill with severe stomach cramps on the evening of Monday the 8th of March, 1886, and because of, or despite, her mother's attentions, she died 2 days later in great agony. No inquest was held, and the death certificate signed by the family doctor, Dr. Thompson, gave the cause as vomiting, convulsions, and spasms of the heart. Mary was able to collect £10 from the insurance company. As was normal at the time, most areas had a usually middle-aged or old lady who laid out the deceased. In this case, it was a Mrs. Sarah Lloyd, and she noticed that Elizabeth's hands were tightly clenched. Interestingly, the doctor hadn't noticed this particular symptom. What is probably most gruesome about the death of the daughter is the fact that her mother tended to her for the whole 2 days she was sick. A little over 7 weeks later, Mary took another trip to the chemist's and purchased a packet of Hunter's Infallible Vermin and Insect Destroyer from Killington's, the local chemists. It was not to be used on the mice, but for her next intended victim, which was her husband Thomas, which would remove another obstacle preventing her from a life with her lover, Thomas Dixon. On the evening of the 30th of April, Thomas came home from work, and after his supper, he began displaying the same symptoms as Elizabeth had, suffering for 4 days, before finally succumbing on the 3rd of May. Dr. Tucker, who was a different physician from the one who had attended Elizabeth, was called, and the cause of death was inexplicably diagnosed as epilepsy. It can be assumed that a different doctor was summoned to pronounce death in order not to raise suspicion about two such similar incidents in her home. Her husband's death yielded nearly £20 insurance. Mary's friend, Mary Dixon, had helped nurse Thomas and offered Mary a great deal of sympathy and support in her bereavement on the tragedy of losing a daughter and her husband in such a short space of time. Sadly for Mary Dixon, we can only assume she was not aware of her own husband's affair, and she invited the widow to their house whenever she wanted to go. Following the death of Thomas, Mary spent a great deal of time with the Dixon family, who lived across the street at 128 Turner Lane. This must have been a particularly uncomfortable period for Thomas Dixon, with his wife and his lover eating at the same table. Sadly for Mary Dixon, it was at this table that she became fatally unwell on the 13th of May. She, like the Britlands, became violently ill, collapsing in spasms and dying in the early hours of the following day. Dr. Thompson was called to the awful ending to the life of Mary Dixon, her husband reportedly distraught by the passing of his wife. The death certificate gave the cause as abdominal spasms. As with the previous two deaths, the body of Mrs. Dixon was laid out by Sarah Lloyd, who at once noted that the hands of the deceased were clenched tightly, the same circumstances she had witnessed when attending the body of Elizabeth Britland. Whether Sarah reported her suspicions, or the fact that a post-mortem was carried out on Mary Dixon at the request of the doctor, this death was treated with suspicion. The post-mortem analysis found both arsenic and strychnine in the stomach and tissue samples. Subsequent police investigations found that Mary had purchased rat poison, ostensibly for killing the mice, which infested Turner Lane. At the time, the chemist was required to obtain a signature on the poison register when anybody bought lethal mixes such as these. With the overwhelming evidence, Mary was arrested and charged with murder, and the local community was shocked to the core at such events. The case against her began to take shape. Mary was finally interviewed by the police in connection with Mrs. Dixon's death, and she was immediately arrested, along with Thomas Dixon. She confessed to Ashton police that she had wanted to marry Dixon and that she had first poisoned her daughter, Elizabeth, because she believed that her daughter suspected her intentions. She then killed her husband and finally married Dixon. Thomas Dixon was initially charged with being an accessory to the crime, but the case was not proceeded with, and he was released. The trial commenced on the 22nd of July 1886 at Manchester Assizes, and it lasted 2 days, and the evidence was overwhelming. The accused was tried with the murder of 3 victims, but Thomas Dixon was found to have played no part in the death of his wife. Dr. Harris told the court of the findings of poison in the bodies of Thomas and Elizabeth Britland. By the time of the autopsies, there was no trace of strychnine, as it is quickly absorbed, but arsenic was shown to be present. Mary's defence solicitor, Mr. Blair, told the jury that she had no motive to kill the 3 people that she was supposed to have murdered. The judge, Mr. Justice Kay, explained to them that they did not need a motive to convict her and only had to be certain that she was the killer. Since there was an absence of motive, in her defence, she argued that the small sum of money from the insurance payouts was in no way compensation for the loss of her husband and daughter. She had purchased rat poison in sufficient quantities to kill them all, and there was no evidence of any mice on whom it could have been legitimately used. The case of the poisoning of Mrs. Dixon was the only one actually that was tried, but the deaths of the others were proved to show a system and rebut the defense argument that it was an accident. Even if there had not been sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, Mary had many indiscreet conversations about what she called mouse powder and poisoning, and had been anxious to discover whether such poisoning could be traced after death. Having deliberated for 2 hours, the foreman of the jury returned to tell the judge that they had been unable to reach a verdict. He sent them back to deliberate further, but even by 10 o'clock that night, they had still not come to a conclusion. After some further directions and clarification from the judge, they returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. After she was sentenced, she shouted to the court, "I am quite innocent. I'm not guilty at all." But she was found guilty, and when asked whether she had anything to say regarding why sentence should not be passed, not only did she burst into floods of tears and continue to scream for mercy when the death sentence was pronounced. While being taken down to the cells, her cries still reverberated around the crowded courtroom and were even heard by those outside the building. Mary had a visit in prison a short time after her conviction, during which she is said to have confessed to her crimes to her mother and surviving daughter. Yet another traumatic event in the life of the teenage Susanna, and dreadful for Mary's mother to hear that the child she had brought up committed such terrible crimes. One can only imagine the sorrow they would have felt on leaving Mary that day, especially for Susanna, on the realization that she had lost her father and sister and was soon to lose her mother too. In a condemned cell, Mary continued to maintain that she was innocent and expected a sudden reprieve, but this didn't happen. As the customary 3 weeks dragged by, she was reduced to a shadow of her former self, hardly eating or sleeping. On the morning of her execution, Monday the 9th of August, she was almost in a complete state of collapse, the 2 female warders having to support her, while the executioner pinioned her, ready for the ordeal. As he did so, she continued to moan, the only coherent words from her being, "I must have been mad." The procession made its way to the scaffold, the wardresses almost having to carry her. She sobbed piteously as James Berry, the executioner, pulled the hood over her head. Holding the woman on the drop, while the hangman placed the noose in position around her neck, the 2 wardresses were then replaced by 2 male warders, who watched Berry intently for the signal. On him giving it, they instantly released their hold on the prisoner and stepped off the drop, as simultaneously the hangman operated the lever, and before Mary could even buckle at the knees, the trapdoors opened. Death was instantaneous, as her neck broke. In his book, My Experiences as an Executioner, James Berry, one of Britain's most famous executioners, served as the nation's hangman between 1884 and 1892, and dispatched 126 men and 5 women, expressed the opinion that those murderers who are most brutal and cold-blooded while committing the act for which they had been condemned to death were the most cowardly when they had to face the consequences. This was most certainly the case with Mary Britland.